Okay, we are at Winfield, Kansas, and we are with Marvin Redeker.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Marvin, can you tell me where you were born
Lincoln, Kansas, out on a farm,
and what's your birth date?
November 11th, 1926.
Okay, and then so you lived most of your life in what town?
I lived in the country 12 miles from town.
And what was the closest town?
Well, we had a little town had about 30 people in it. It was Westfall, but we done. I went to what a high school education I did get was in Lincoln, Kansas.
Okay.
But otherwise, I was went to school out in the country. I went to a country school for 12 years.
Okay.
And
12 years. Okay.
well, I shouldn't say 8 years, I should say. And then I started a high school, and my mother got deathly sick, so I did not get to finish high school. But I do have my high school diploma today. I got it after I finished everything else.
That's great. So, do you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have. Now I've only got one brother and one sister still living. The others have already passed on. I've got two brothers have passed on. No, three. Three brothers have passed on. And my baby sister. There was 6 of us children altogether.
And so were your parents farmers?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. That's a great profession. So then you went home to help. So were you drafted or did you enlist in the?
I was drafted. I turned 18 on the 11th of November of 1944. And in January of 1946, I reported to Fort Lewis, Washington, or to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to take my first physical. I don't know if they thought I was too young, but then they sent me back home and told me that they was going to call me at a later date. I waited almost 15 months before I was called into active duty. And then I took my big step, and I was in the Army then.
Army. You're in the Army now.
That's right.
So where did you do your basic training?
I never did have hardly any basic training.
Really?
Well, I'm going to read you a little bit of history that came out of the Hillsborough paper back in 10 years ago.
Okay.
I attended got to go to Washington, D.C. and got to see the World War II memorial with my daughter. And this is what it says. I was in Fort Lewis, Washington from Leavenworth. Riding a train for 3 days. I left for Fort Lewis. Basic training about 2 weeks when I got the mumps. And I was approximately 4 weeks in the hospital when the doctor said he would not release me until I was able to get along. And the swelling was all gone. When I went back to my barracks, my company had all finished there and skipped out, and I don't know where they went, but they all never did know. The sergeant told me the second day I was out of the hospital that I had a job for me, and I became a supply clerk for him. And I did the job at approximately 3 months, and then Japan was bombed. I received my orders that I was to ship to San Francisco, California for 14 days. I was in the ship in Yokohama. After landing there, we took a train to Seoul, and there we loaded on trucks, and the country coming to an area where we're sitting, and there was nothing but tents. As I got off the truck, the commander welcomed us to Japan. One of the first things he did was call out my name and reported to me. I reported to him, and he told me my job would be to be in the supply room as long as I was in Japan, and would take care of all the supplies that the men needed for the weapons, but clothing and everything else. I said this knowledge was a private life. Afterwards, I would thank God and let Him head ground me in my life. That was what in the Hillsborough Star Journal. You can still get a copy of that from them if you want it.
Okay, I will look for that.
I would make a copy of that if you want it.
Well, I could do that. That would be great. So your service time was in the supplies.
After I got out of the hospital, because I only started a week or two into basic training when I got deathly sick. And I went to my platoon sergeant and told him that I did not feel like training that day, because I said, I don't feel a bit good. And he looked at me and he said, "Soldier, you're going to the doctor." Just like that, he told me. So I went to the doctor, and when I got to the doctor looked at me for probably 5 or 10 minutes, and he felt around on me, and he told me, he says, "You're going to the hospital, soldier, and you're going to stay there until that swelling is all gone." Because he said, "You may not know it, but you got the mumps. Where did you come from?" I says, "Well, I came from Kansas just here 2 weeks ago." Well, he says, "Very likely you came in contact with someone aboard train, and that's how you got your mumps." So he says, "You're going to bed, and you're going to stay there until it's all gone." But God had a plan for me. I became discouraged when I laid there in the hospital day after day after day. There was days that I could hardly swallow my throat. I was swelled from my ears to my shoulders. And it was rough. But God had a plan for me. Yeah. And when I got out of the hospital, I went back to my barracks, and as it stated in that letter, there wasn't anybody there anymore. All was in there was my clothes. The first day that I was out of the hospital, I just sat in my barracks and looked at the 4 walls because there was nobody else around. And after I had spent the night, I got up the next morning and I was so hungry because I hadn't eaten hardly anything the day before. And I went to the mess hall and got me a good breakfast. I don't think I'd been back to my barracks 10 minutes when my sergeant that had sent me to the doctor came into the office or the barracks and told me, he says, "Marvin," he says, "what are your plans? I got notice from the hospital that you just been released." I said, "Yes, Sergeant, I was released yesterday." Well, he said, "What are your plans?" I said, "Well, I'm just waiting on orders." He says, "You don't have any orders?" I said, "No, Sergeant, I have got no orders." I said, "I'm just waiting to see what I'm supposed to do." Well, he says, "If that's the case, come with me." He says, "I got a job for you." He says, "You're going to have to take charge." He says, "You're not going to have the sergeant rating, but he says, that's going to be your responsibility." He says, "I want you to take care of all of we got men coming in, they're going to need their uniforms, their clothing, everything that they need, their helmets, their shoes, their weapons and everything." And he says, "I'm going to show you what to do." And he says, "From here on, it's up to you. If you need some help," he says, "I'm just next door." He says, "I'll help you." That started me on what wound up being my lifetime occupation, was serving people. Because God had a plan for me then, and He still has it to this day.
You went to California, and then you were shipped overseas?
I was aboard ship for 14 days on the Pacific.
And where did you end up?
In Yokohama, Japan.
Japan is where you were stayed there with the troops that were there?
No, I was shipped by train then to Osaka, Japan, and which was to Yokohama is on the north end of Japan. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but we went clear to the south end of Japan by train. We went by electric train. We went right by where they had dropped those big bombs. There was nothing there. There was just total destruction.
So how long had it been since the bombs had dropped
that
you went by?
About a day, about a month.
About a month.
We were one of the first troops that went into occupied Japan. We were the 65th Engineer Combat Battalion, part of the 25th Infantry Division, which is the Lightning Division. And that's probably what you hear of it to this day yet. It's the Lightning Division instead of 25th Infantry Division, but it's in the history books of the 65th Engineer Combat Battalion being part of the 25th Infantry Division. So that's where I went.
And so it just looked like nothing was there, just rubble.
That's right. And after we got to Seoul, there we got onto Army trucks, and they put all of our luggage and so forth on those trucks, and we aboarded the trucks, and they took us out in a country, I would guess 8 or 10 miles, I don't know. We drove for some time, but you never can tell when you're aboarding a truck how many miles you've driven. When the trucks all stopped, we got off, and all there was just one row of tents after another. We lived in tents for over 6 months, all winter. There was 4 of us in a tent.
Was it cold weather in the winter, or was it not?
I only saw snow one time, and as I stated, they stated in the Hillsborough paper that when we got to Japan and got to Seoul, our commanding officer was Lieutenant Kropa. He was our company commander, and he welcomed us when we got off the trucks, because they told us to get into formation the minute we got off the trucks. And he welcomed us to Japan, and he said, "Here is where you're going to be your home while you're here in Japan." He says, "You're going to live 4 in a tent." And he said, the large tent to my right and back of me is where you're going to get your food. Anybody had any questions? He says, "One thing you will not do, you will not go into town. It is very dangerous." Because he said, "There's a hatred here that you cannot overcome." Well, I had 2 men assigned to me under me in order to take care of the supplies for my total company, everything that we needed as far as the company was concerned. I had 1 man worked under me from Louisiana. I'll never forget this man. He was older than I. I was only 19 years of age when I had that total responsibility. And after I had that responsibility, he came after we'd been there probably 4 or 5 months. And he came to me and told me one evening, he says, "Marvin," he says, "I'm going into town tonight." I said, "You know better. You know what the commander told us." Well, he says, "I'm going anyway." It was a disgrace for me, because when he came back within 2 hours, when he went to find, he never found, but he found out what it was like. He had the plain hell beat out of him. He was black and blue. I hardly knew him. I wonder what happened to him, because it was part of what I went through when I was over in Japan. We were not permitted to go into town. We were restricted to the company tent area. I issued the weapons. I had kept every serial number. I'd done everything that I was supposed to do. I've got a string of medals. I think there's 6 of them in a row. Of occupation medal, World War II medal, Army Occupational Medal. I don't know what they all are. I don't remember. My daughter's got my book that I had gotten when I made a trip to Washington, and it's all in there, but I didn't bring it here. So, what?
So you were doing the supplies, but the rest of the Army, what were they doing during the day? Were they helping the Japanese get back on their feet, or do you know what they were doing?
My company, all they'd done was try to reconstruct part of what had been destroyed, because we were an engineer combat battalion. And about a week or 2 before I got my orders to come back to the States, they moved all of our supplies into some real nice barracks. But I did not get to live there but just a week or 2 when my serial number came up in order to report back to the States.
You were glad to go.
Yes, ma'am, because after you're confined to some tent area for 6 months or more, between 880 and 200 days, then you're ready to come back to life.
You bet. So When did you get discharged?
April 16th, 1947. No, 46. I turned 20 when I was over in Japan.
So you were home then when VE Day happened?
No, ma'am.
No, okay.
No.
Oh, that's right, because it would have been in 45.
I went in 45 and got out in 46.
Okay. Gotcha.
I don't know what the heck they classified me with anything. Those 14 or 15 months that I waited to be called into active duty, I don't know if they had. I don't think that shows up on my records anyplace because my records were all burned in St. Louis when they had that fire back. Oh, it's been probably 30 years ago when a lot of the records were burned there in St. Louis.
Okay. So you got back to the United States and you...
We had nobody that met us. We never had a band. We never had anybody that greeted us when we docked. And we spent 13 days coming back. So I spent 27 days of that 7-8 months aboard the ocean in the Pacific.
Did you like that, being on the water?
No, I did not, because I was real concerned because I knew the Japanese had put a lot of mines out there in those waters. And I was expecting anything to happen any minute. There was none of us that actually was at peace the whole time that we were there.
When you got back to the United States, it was a big relief.
Yes, ma'am.
So,
and one thing I might mention, we had on our way back, we had an experience that I'll never forget. And we were about a day out of San Francisco, and all of a sudden, they gave the distress signal across the loud system in the board of the ship, because we were on what they call a troop ship. It was a general something, I don't remember. I should have wrote all that stuff down, but that's been 70, 80 years ago. And I'd forgotten more than I probably should have, but anyway, we was about a day out of San Francisco, and when they gave that distress signal, they said it was a man overboard. And at the rear end of the ship, they threw out one of these, I called it a donut. And anyway, the man grabbed a hold of that anyway, and they said he had fallen down an elevator shaft when he was over Japan, and had moved up his brains. He didn't have full sense anymore, and he was coming back to the States. And they turned that big ship around out there in the ocean. They tried to lower the lifeboats over the side to pick him up. They couldn't get the engine started. They hoisted over, they couldn't get it. They finally found one that started. They left it over the side, and they had some of the crew that went up and brought him aboard, but they could not raise that lifeboat again. They had to bring him up on a ladder in order to get him back up on board. And we towed that behind us into the night. And then all of a sudden it was go boom! And they sank that boat out there because they were not going to let anybody get a hold of that boat. So that
you blew it up.
They blew that boat all to smithereens.
Oh my gosh.
With a big gun aboard that ship.
Wow.
So that's part of my history that I'll never forget.
I bet not. Oh my gosh. They didn't let you know, and so you were, for a minute, didn't know what was going on.
No, because we thought maybe we had been attacked, because we didn't know until we found out.
Oh, wow. Make your heart race. So, did you ever have a chance to meet General Eisenhower?
No, I never did. He was stationed at Fort Lewis at the time ahead of me, because part of his career was at Fort Lewis, Washington.
Do you think that the military made a difference in your life?
The military gave me what I needed, because I did not get to finish high school like a lot of other children did, because I took care of my family. I'd done all the cooking and the baking and washing and ironing and milking the cows and feeding the chickens and gathering the eggs and done everything that there was to do. And I had younger brothers and a sister that was in grade school. I fixed all of their lunches for them for nearly 2 years in order so that they could go to school, because our country schools did not have a lunch program. They had to take their own lunch to school. I had that responsibility in order to keep my family together. And that's what I've done all my life. Because after spending 28 years well, first of all, after my wife is from Durham, Kansas originally. And after we had met, and that was because I was invited to help her celebrate her birthday, that I met her for the first time. We were married for over 60 years when she passed away overnight with a sudden heart attack. And
I'm sorry.
I spent 28 years with the co-ops and 50 years with the Lions Club. And I've been a member since 1948 with the VFW, and I've got certificates of award from about 15 or 20 from the VFW for being past commander of the post in Marion, Kansas. And I've got a lifetime membership in that organization. I've also got a lifetime membership in the American Legion. And I've worked in my church for over 60 years. And I took care of the Marion County Fair Association for 25 years. I was the one who took charge of everything there for that county fair.
Well, thank you so much.
And I spent 40 years taking care of one water system. And then another company came and begged me, the one that served part of Dickinson County, for 17 years after I had planned to retire. So I read all of those meters. I read 330 some meters every month. It took its toll on my life.
Well, Marvin, thank you for talking to us today. Thank you for your service and for everything you've done.
I pray that this will be a benefit to somebody along the line, because I owe God everything. There's not anything that has ever happened to me in my lifetime that I cannot accredit him to.
Amen.